for me is at the heart, and that's what the Nobel laureate Stiglitz says. Next slide, yeah. Okay, so the key point here is that, we should see development strategy aimed at transforming society and removing barriers. One of those barriers is illiteracy, poor health, so that people can have, a much more fruitful life. Then, in the 1965 or thereabout, a professor at Institute of Development Studies in the UK, Dudley Sear, summarized for us 3 lenses we can look at development. It says, if a country has rising poverty, rising inequality, rising unemployment, it's not developing. It doesn't matter whether the GDP figures show development. So if you use these 3 lenses, rising poverty, is the poverty going down or rising? 2, is unemployment going up or down? 3, is inequality expanding or contracting? He said that is the measure of development. So when we look at public finance management and want to use public finance to catalyze development, the question there will now be, next slide. Okay. So still on what is development, I quoted my sample, that country. So we want country. So we want to say whether Nigeria is rich or not in reality. These are some of the considerations we have to bear in mind. Next slide. Okay. Okay, so this is a bit of economic theory, but I won't waste much time so I get to where how much is happening to GDP capital. We move to capital, we move to second stage, we will talk about human capital, not just fiscal capital. Are we raising human beings? So today, raising human beings. So today, many of you parliamentarians go through the Human Development Index of your country. That is where we are now. We're looking at both healthcare, education as measure of economic development. The third generation, African ADB, I used to consult and speak at their events. They are now doing a lot on public finance management structure, trying to create. For Nigeria, we run a constitutional democracy, and all the African countries here, West African countries here, are all constitutional democracies. The patterns, the constitutions are the same. But there's something that we have in the Nigerian constitution, which they call the fundamental objectives and directive principle of state policy, chapter 2. Interestingly, this chapter of the Constitution principles should apply to every public official. So you have a problem. You can't go to court to get remedy, but the public officials ought to apply it. Now, what is important about this? This section was taken from the Indian constitutional section, and it focuses on social economic rights. So, objectives. Now, I want to bring out what the 3 ones I call the 3 constitutional operatives of Nigeria. The first is growth. Every parliament Muslim constitution must ensure that the constitutional imperative number 1. Number 2 is that that policy must also lead to social justice, which is it creates equal access. There was a time in this parliament when the previous government wanted to borrow a lot of money, and we did analysis. So that imperative, both the projects and the borrowing, are regulated. Our constitution does not support the idea of laissez-faire. That means any policy, no, just privatize, give to private sector, PPP, borrow money. No, the government must continue to regulate those projects. Next slide. Okay, just to some basic about Nigeria, since we are hosting this event. 3 approach: unemployment, poverty. You see where we are in poverty? It drastically and took millions out of become labor-intense production. So China went from low technology, labor-based, therefore expanded earning and enterprise, TVE, was, instead of privatizing, China used village enterprises to grow wealth. If you look at unemployment, well, this is the old methodology. Now we have changed it to 4.something%, but then we're the second largest in the world after South Africa. And then, of course, underemployment and so on. Next slide. For this, that they had enough money to lift all Nigerians above poverty level, measured at $1.90. They had enough money to, so being billionaire is not a problem. I'm looking at inequality. Nigeria has one of the highest Guinea inequality. Next slide. So the question then is, some fundamental truths I want to talk about debt and development. First, is that debt is an alternative to internal capital formation. Development requires financing, which can come through domestic savings or borrowing. Arthur Lewis was the first and only black Nobel laureate in economics. In those days, the idea was that you need to save nationally about 12 to 14% to have a chance to develop. So countries need to have high-level national savings. That's what Asia had. They save a lot of money. And that's why you look at sovereign wealth funds like in Norway, Finland, even Dubai. That's national saving. Now, when countries don't have the discipline to save, then their next alternative is borrowing, because you need capital. Secondly, so ordinarily, public finance, development should be financed with domestic savings. But when you cannot do that, you borrow. So when you are going to develop without capital formation, you resort to borrowing. And then, of course, debt will be serviced by export earning like in Nigeria, or you can also, so it will constrain import and lead to more borrowing. So it becomes a vicious. Okay. The key point here is well implemented. That it drives you towards development that may have spillover effect that helps you to pay off. That's why oftentimes when we campaign against too much borrowing, they say, oh, look at America, look at China. They borrow a lot more than you. But they have more, first, absorption capacities that within the tenure of that debt could have created multiple wealth, and then from abundance, you pay off. But we are the serious debt crisis in the 1980s that led to demand for debt forgiveness, which Nigeria finally got off debt in 2012, I think. But we are back, 2011, we are back to serious debt. So this is what employment or salary income. So debt servicing is a fixed charge on domestic income and savings. As the size of debt grows or the interest rises, debt services charge increases. Next slide. Now, I talk about, the most important determinant of the impact of debt is what we call basic transfer. Now, let's forget the mathematics. What this means is that as we affect your, so I can get to, okay. These are just basic timeline. Next slide, let's leave this. Okay, how, what Nigeria has been borrowing and so on and so forth. Next slide. I will show some, as at June 2021, this is far old. Next slide. This is under President Buhari. You see, he's borrowing. Next slide. Jonathan, a different year. Next slide. Obasanjo, who finally paid off debts, and you can see we started borrowing again. Next slide. Okay. So the idea here, we didn't put Tinubu because the government is still borrowing, but at the last count, this government has borrowed more than all these governments, that have gone before. Now, the problem is that our people says that our debt to GDP is small, which is okay. The World Bank has a standard for debt to GDP, and that standard means if your debt to GDP ratio, meaning how much of your debt over your GDP, how much is it if you compare with the GDP? So if you look at Nigeria, we had about, so it should be more than this. World Bank says 22.5% is okay. But today, debt service to revenue is the worst. We are spending, as of January, it was 144%. What that means that for every 100 naira we earn, we borrow extra 44 naira to service. So, debt to GDP might be okay, but debt to servicing is very bad. In most countries, it's about 15%, highest 2025. But in Nigeria, as of January, it was 144. That's not, which means 45% of the budget allocated for 2025 is going to go to debt servicing. That's a lot. We are servicing debt with more of our revenue than they are doing. Next slide. Okay, so with all these various laws that define debt to GDP, debt management. First, the Constitution Act, Fiscal Responsibility Act, Fiscal Regulation Act, Public Service Act, Treasury Circular, Federal Inland Revenue Service Act, Central Bank Act. So what I've done here is to lay out the various toolbox for purpose of legislative control. What are the legal framework that we use? No, can you go back, sorry? Next slide, go back. I think we got something wrong. Okay, that's fine, go back here. Constitutional principles for public debt management. Expenditure, public value, legislative oversight, competitiveness and value for money, prudence and effectiveness. Next slide. Next slide, yeah. Okay, so separation of power is actually the strongest concept in public finance management. Why is it so? First, it gives this assembly the power to do things at the federal government, even though the executive branch has the power to run the economy. The power of appropriation is in the parliament. The power of fiscal regulation and the judiciary with adjudication. Next slide. So I'll be fast here. Next slide, yeah. Okay. So, now the point I want to make is that, go back. The Constitution is designed in a way that the executive power and its exercise is limited. And this is oftentimes, when I was a special advisor to the Senate president here long ago, I used to say that Nigerians said that the Nigerian presidency is too powerful. It's not true. Unlike in the US Constitution, where Article 1, Article 2, and others are distinct, Section 5 power of the president is conditioned to two things, except where the Constitution bestows on the president an express authority. Every of his power can be controlled, reduced, removed by ordinary law of parliament. So who is stronger? Parliament. So the parliament, that's why when you did your Petroleum Act before, and you say only the Minister of Petroleum can allocate oil block, and the president allocated oil block, the Supreme Court says the president cannot, it must be the Minister of Petroleum. And that's why Nigerian presidents now answer Minister of Petroleum. What does that mean? It means that the parliament can describe these rights as they want. Next slide. Okay, so this is what I just mentioned. Shall extend to the assembly makes law, it conditions the president's extent of his power under section 5(2). Next slide. Okay. So that's the point I tried to make. So although the president has personal power, it's subject to whatever law National Assembly makes. Next slide. Okay. Now, there's also judicial limitation of this power, Constitution, and the National Assembly interprets the Constitution. Next slide. Okay, so if you look at National Assembly as a finance board, so the first point we've made is that National Assembly has powers to define how the executive can make laws, and once it defines it, it stays. Again, now we want to look at as a watchdog. What does that mean? It means that the Constitution has designated National Assembly 3 and sections 80 to 88. Next slide. Okay. So the power of legislative oversight. So the lawmaking power includes the power of oversight. Oversight is an established national understanding of the implication of lawmaking power. There's 2, impeachment process, 3, confirmatory process, 4, appropriation process, 5, authorization process, and 6, budgeting process. So all of these are contained in section 80 to 88 of the Constitution. Next slide. Now, this is where I want to pay more attention to. The National Assembly has made a law to define how it can exercise legislative oversight. So, if you look at, for example, item 7 of the Constitution, item 7 lists borrowing of money within outside Nigeria for the purpose of the Federation on any law or any of the states as within the legislative competence of the National Assembly to make law as well as its oversight function. Clear that the oversight of borrowing lies with the National Assembly. And as I argue, it is the manner for the President to exercise executive power of the Federation, subject to any law made by the National Assembly. Any proposed borrowing that does not follow the condition laid by these laws will be incompetent. So if government borrows money contrary to these regulations the National Assembly has made, it shall be incompetent. Next slide. Secondly, no, next slide, sorry, it's a repetition, next slide, yeah. Next slide. Okay. Now, what does that mean? Legislative creates an oversight mechanism that effective, and the point here is very clear, that being the power of the purse belongs to the legislature because it appropriates, it oversights borrowing, it ensures that in terms of the FRA, budget to parastatals create obligation of oversight. Next slide. Okay. Now, in reality, this power is not unlimited. Court of Appeal says, yes, oversight is a great power, but it has to be subject to either lawmaking, either review of budget apropos. In Nerofan's case, the Court of Appeal, House of Reps was angry about his comment he made abusing the House, and the House issued a warrant purportedly as part of its oversight power. And the court says no, the only way you can exercise those. Next slide. Okay, the same with the case of Tony Momo and the Senate of Nigeria, where the Court of Appeal, Nemeka Siago, argued that Section 82.2 is designed to eliminate abuse. Any invitation by the House to any person outside the purpose defined by Section 72 of the Constitution is invalid. No power exists outside the section for general investigation for aggrandizement of the House. The point there is that somebody could quarrel with somebody, or somebody has an issue. The House does not have general investigative power. That's what the Constitution is trying to say. Next slide. Okay. So this is very important legal framework for valid exercise of. With the borrow money contrary to FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act is very strict. It's clear that any government of the Federation or its agencies and corporations that desires to borrow money shall specify the purpose for which the borrow is intended and present a cost-benefit analysis. Why is cost and development or lack of it? So what the Constitution and the legal framework expects is that when you are borrowing, you have to lay before the House cost-benefit analysis. Why is this money needed? In the next 10 years, what investments will come out of it? How will it increase growth, reduce unemployment, reduce poverty? This is the requirement why it's important. So you must show prior authorization and you must show approval by this House. Next slide. So he talks about the legal framework under the Fiscal Responsibility Act. If you look at that act very well, it talks about first, he still talks about the specific responsibility of the National Assembly and the Central Bank of Nigeria. The Debt Management Office shall maintain comprehensive, reliable, and current electronic database of internal and external borrowing. They maintain that database. The DMO does that, and the House should also have their own. Next slide. Now, if you look at the DMO Act, it clearly, the Minister of the Federation shall not approve any external borrowing unless the terms and conditions should have been laid before the National Assembly before approval. So, if the House has not approved the term and conditions, no borrowing. Again, before the federal government and the state to get a loan, there must be approval by the minister. But is that even the